Recently, Frank Turek's team posted a video titled Thoughtful Skeptic Challenges Frank on the Resurrection. In a world of clickbait and hyperbolic titles, this is very subdued and respectful, so couldn't help but be curious.
Christians overstate the case.
Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. And today, that's Frank Turek on one of his many college Q&A sessions when he encountered someone the title calls a thoughtful skeptic and the description calls a friendly skeptic. This is a huge testament to the skeptical question asker for presenting himself in such a way that forced the Christian audience to take him seriously and hear what he had to say. Let's see how it went.
I wanted to ask, you said that the apostles died for their faith, or were willing to die for their faith.
Mm-hmm.
Apostles is kind of a nebulous term, so I was going to go by what Sean McDowell's called his doctoral thesis on the apostle martyrdom. And so he said the 11 original disciples, minus Judas, of course,
right,
plus Paul would be the apostles.
Perfect start. Defining terms is a very important way to start.
Is what is meant by an apostle.
I'm a big advocate of defining terms, so this is a great start. Apostle is a particularly slippery word because even in the New Testament, it has multiple meanings depending on the context.
And he says that we can only say with relative certainty that 4 of them died and only 2 of them with accurate certainty. So I was just curious.
Yeah, I agree with Sean. Sean did some great work on that. I think Christians overstate the case when they try and say all 11 died. That's probably true, but we can't confirm.
Well, John didn't die.
I can't imagine on what basis Frank says it's probably true, when in the same breath he's admitting that there's insufficient evidence to confirm it.
What's that?
John didn't die for sure.
Right,
because he was
right. Yeah, 10 out of the 11, whatever. 11 out of the 12 if you include Paul, right? Okay. But Sean McDowell, who did his PhD research on this, his dissertation said we have really good evidence from the first century for Peter, Paul, and 2 Jameses.
Well, James and the 2 James the son of Zebedee, and James the brother of Jesus are a notch lower. They're not on the same level as Peter and Paul.
Okay, right.
This is a bit of a moving target, but mostly right. In Sean's original edition of Fate of the Apostles from 2015, he put Peter, Paul, and James son of Zebedee at the highest level, and James the brother of Jesus 1 notch down. For years now in interviews, Sean announced that he would be moving James son of Zebedee down a notch, so I think our skeptic was very correct in his interpretation. Oddly, in Sean's 10th anniversary 2nd edition, which recently came out and I just bought today, Peter stays at the top tier, and James the brother of Jesus has been promoted to join him. Both Paul and James son of Zebedee have been demoted to 2nd tier. I'm not sure why James and Paul swapped, but neither are members of the 12, so it ultimately doesn't affect this conversation. Let me know if you'd like a video detailing all the changes in the new edition. There seems to be surprises and demotions.
But there's still good evidence.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I don't think that the evidence is as good for those 2, the 2 Jameses. And so I feel like it's easier to justify why 2 people would die for something they genuinely believe in, whereas the other, and as opposed to a lot more than that.
It's true. When you're accounting for only 2 people, it's a lot easier to imagine scenarios where 2 people are sincerely mistaken. This is amazing. I have no idea if this question asker is familiar with me or my channel and my minimal witnesses hypothesis. In short, to account for the established history of Christianity, we need only a single disciple to claim Jesus rose, a later convert who hallucinated the same, and an urban legend to spread. It wouldn't be surprising if he came to these opinions entirely on his own. Either way, I'm pretty excited to see argumentation similar to my own playing out in the wild by someone Frank calls thoughtful and friendly.
So I was just curious.
Well, you got to evaluate the evidence for yourself, but what we do know from the ancient world is there is no evidence that anyone ever recanted. And you would think if this was invented, people would be giving up, giving the thing up all the time.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that it was invented, but I was more curious just because, we don't necessarily know if they had the opportunity to recant either.
Exactly. A lack of recanting is meaningful only if they were given a chance to recant.
And there is no evidence that any of the apostles recanted their beliefs.
But as I was just saying, there's no evidence of any of the apostles being given an opportunity to recant. So we're basically at an impasse on this one. But you also can't argue they died for their beliefs without establishing that the reason they died was their beliefs. Frank is forced to agree.
Well, they were persecuted in general, right? It wasn't just to the death.
I mean,
right? In fact, if you notice, most of the New Testament documents are writing about suffering.
Yeah, that's true. I think, but there were also time periods later on where like the persecution went down and like went up and stuff. It wasn't like constant persecution.
Right, it's true.
Well done. On occasion, some of the early Christians were troublemakers and suffered consequences because of their disruptive behavior. But generally, early Christians had a very live and let live existence, and only relatively infrequently were bothered because of their ideology, though unfortunately it did happen sometimes. And Frank again had to concede his point.
But they could have voted with their feet, right?
True, yeah.
They could have just walked away from the persecution, and they didn't.
Yes.
Yeah.
The skeptic could have pressed further to ask who Frank means by they. Going back to his original observation about nebulous terms, I'd say that we have evidence that, of the 12, only Peter and John were out preaching and putting themselves in harm's way. We have no idea what the rest were doing with their feet, let alone how they voted with them.
So, yeah, I think the case can be overstated,
Yes.
but you can also understate it, which I think what skeptics often do.
Sadly, Frank doesn't give an example of what such an understatement would look like. He seems to have pretty much gone along with everything the skeptic is claiming, so Frank's already agreeing with a pretty weak case here.
And again, I would ask them, there's two possibilities here. This really happened or it was invented. I think you have to have a lot more faith to believe it was invented than to believe it really
I
happened.
mean, I don't necessarily know that it was either invented or...
What's the other option?
I would say people are mistaken.
Perfectly handled. For the purposes of this video, what's relevant is the proposal that A. Peter, and Peter alone, had an experience that he sincerely, but mistakenly, attributed to seeing resurrected Jesus. B. Based on Peter's sincerity, others came to believe that they too saw Jesus. C. Years later, Paul had an experience that he sincerely, but mistakenly, attributed to seeing resurrected Jesus.
How could they be mistaken about a bodily resurrection where the tomb was known and any production of a body would have squashed the whole thing?
I mean, was the tomb known, though? Because that's not one of, like, Gary Habermas's minimal facts.
Again, perfectly handled.
Well, Gary will say that at least 75% of scholars admit the empty tomb. Okay.
Yes.
By far, the majority of scholars who grant the empty tomb are Christian scholars. And it doesn't come up to the level, even though it's a majority, if it's around 75%, that's a pretty strong majority. But I like it to be 90% or more for what I'm doing here. For my criteria for accepting something as historical bedrock. So it didn't quite make a strong enough majority, and it's certainly not a robust heterogeneity of scholarship.
What Mike is saying about a lack of heterogeneity of scholarship is that virtually all the scholars who accept this are Christians.
But if anybody started to claim that Jesus had resurrected from the dead, and that creed in 1 Corinthians 15, even Bart Ehrman agrees is within 2 years of the event.
Yeah.
Frank shouldn't get to have this point agreed with. Bart absolutely does not agree that it's within 2 years of the event.
Ehrman allows repeatedly that many of the exceptionally early creedal traditions were established and in existence even before his conversion at just 2 to 3 years after Jesus' crucifixion.
That's completely false. It's completely wrong. I've never thought that. I've never said it. I've never said that they were around before Paul converted. I've never thought that.
Anybody who wanted to squash Christianity, they could have pulled a skeleton out of that tomb and not even known it was Jesus, and it would have ended Christianity.
But if we didn't know that it was a tomb, like if he was put in a mass grave, then...
Exactly. If the Romans were responsible, the body would have been left on the cross, possibly to be eaten by animals, as this humiliation was considered part of the punishment.
Finding a skeleton in a mass
Why
grave
think
would-
he's put in a mass grave?
I just think that that makes the most sense out of the three options that we have for what would happen to a crucifixion victim. Or I guess four.
If I'm right in thinking that this skeptic has been watching or reading my stuff, then the four options are: 1, the Romans dealt with the body; 2, the family dealt with the body; 3, the Sanhedrin dealt with the body; or 4, a powerful person intervened to prevent what usually happens from happening. A great question for Frank is, what does he think happened to the thieves allegedly crucified on either side of Jesus? Or all the Jewish people crucified the week before Jesus? Or the week after Jesus? On those people, he'd agree with me and not be looking for individual affirmational accounts.
Why would you think that? There's no evidence that that's the case. Where does the evidence come from?
Many lines of independent historical evidence show that the Romans, the Sanhedrin, or the family would take charge of crucifixion victims, and what would happen in each circumstance. Any other course of action would be an exception. Absence evidence of an exception, it's fully reasonable to think that the thing that usually happened is what happened. The only reason Frank thinks something else happened to Jesus is because the Bible tells him so.
So like obviously his family wouldn't take him because they were in high order.
Perfect.
And then all we know from the creed is that Jesus was buried. We don't know where he was buried.
Right.
This is true. And the Greek word used there was used in the first century for everything from unmarked ditch graves up to lavish tombs. So it's entirely ambiguous. No tomb is implied.
But the other testimony we have is that Joseph of Arimathea took him to a tomb that had never been used before. And when they did the excavations under the tomb of the Holy Sepulchre, under the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that's the kind of tomb they found.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre, the disputed tourist attraction that we trace back to Emperor Constantine's mom, who went looking for Christian tourist sites in the 4th century, and entirely unsurprisingly, people came up with places for her to find. That Church of the Holy Sepulchre?
Well, I don't think that the evidence for Joseph of Arimathea is that strong because I think that sorry, I just lost my train of thought. My bad. Man. I totally just blanked on what I was going to say. Joseph of Arimathea is part of the word of the Jewish leader people.
Yeah,
right?
he's
Sanhedrin.
a member of the Sanhedrin.
Yeah.
Good recovery. Well done.
And
Which, by the way, is another embarrassing detail. Why would anybody inventing this story say that a guy who sentenced Jesus to die turned out to be a good guy while the disciples who followed Jesus ran away?
Well, because I think people were trying to establish that there was an empty tomb, so you would have to figure out how he got to a tomb.
Exactly. Potential converts would have expected a crucified, out-of-town preacher to end up somewhere unmarked, knowing that exceptions were reserved for the powerful. So the Jesus movement came up with someone powerful.
Why would they want to establish an empty tomb? To get themselves beaten, tortured, and killed?
Well, because they wanted to be able to prove that Jesus was resurrected.
Why?
Because they wanted to continue the belief.
Why?
I don't know. Why not?
Sincere believers are gonna defend their sincerely held beliefs with exaggerations and overconfidences. Earlier in this video, Frank admitted that Christians overstate the case for martyrs. Small exaggerations accumulate into legends. It's possible the author of Mark was willing to just invent the character, but it's also possible this is just part of the story that grew in the decades between Jesus' death and when the first gospel was written. Christianity wasn't all persecution all the time. In those early days, it was disturbing the peace that got them in trouble, not holding competing ideology.
Look, man, you can say anything. You can say that aliens came down and took the body. You can say anything, but a possibility is not evidence.
Yes.
You need evidence for what you say.
If you say so, Frank, it's possible Jesus' body went into a remembered tomb, but that possibility isn't evidence. It's possible that a member of the Sanhedrin who voted to kill Jesus in the morning loved him so much he wanted to put him in his personal tomb later that night, but the possibility isn't evidence. It's possible the witnesses to risen Jesus were putting themselves in harm's way, but that possibility isn't evidence. In your analogy, you're the one saying that aliens came down, not the question asker.
And all the evidence is on the side that Jesus rose from the dead. You can speculate any way you want, and you can believe that. But if Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
This is Frank exiting a conversation that he was losing and was never going to win. You can believe that, is what you say to end the discussion on evidence.
If Christianity were true, would you become a Christian?
So I was thinking about this while you were talking.
It's yes or no?
Well, so my thing is, like,
No.
you
Okay,
believe Christianity is
got it.
true.
Go ahead.
You believe that Christianity is true. And so for me, like, if Christianity is true in the way that it's true for you, then probably not, because I'm not. But if it was true
Well,
for me,
what do you mean true for me? What does that mean?
well, like, you believe it because you see evidence and
Yeah.
you evaluate that evidence and you think that it's true. So if I evaluated the evidence and believed that it was true, then I would believe it. Is my point. I would say yes. I'll just simplify it. Yes, I would. If it was true.
That was our skeptic attempting to be honest, but unfortunately, his honesty probably came across as equivocation to the Christians in the audience, who can then in their head impugn his motive and ignore that he just bested Frank on evidence. Admittedly, this is a little simpler for me, because I was very happy being a Christian. So if I came to be convinced again, I would obviously be convinced again, and could pragmatically go along with whatever version of Christianity I became convinced of. Our skeptic's answer was fine and true for him, but it will sadly likely be used to discredit him.
Okay, so if I gave you a book, would you read it?
Probably yes.
No, not probably.
Yes, I would read. I have a long reading list, but I would eventually get to it. I promise.
If it's I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist that you co-wrote with Norman Geisler, I've already read it. I've also read your Stealing from God and Hollywood Heroes books, which we debated on once. Your other books seem more about social and political agendas than the truth of Christianity, so I'd pass on those. If you happen to be the question asker in this video, I just want to say well done, and I'd love to hear more about your experience with Frank in the comments below. It is so great to see minimal witness argumentation popping up in the wild and shutting down one of the most practiced apologists in the country.
Give him a book, would you? Thank you.
I'm glad to believe that.
If you'd like to hear more of this former Christian, taking a look at the claims of Christians, tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.